Okay. Well, the last thing we want to cover is class-based components. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, we cover this briefly. So let's go to class-based components. So as we noted, everything we've done so far has been functional components that look sort of like this. But let's talk about what class-based components look like. And to understand class-based components, we first had to understand classes in JavaScript. So luckily, it's pretty similar to what we did in Python. So we're going to actually do a split screen thing here. This is separate from my React project. So I'm just doing this in the same window just to make my life a little easier. So I'm going to create a class.py file. Let's call it classes. Classes.py, and then we're going to create a classes.js. Again, we're going to kind of highlight the differences and similarities between creating a class in Python, which we're hopefully familiar with at this point, and working with classes in JavaScript. So to do that, I'm going to close all my other React files. They're not needed right now. Again, this is separate from React. This is just conceptually understanding classes in JavaScript and React. So on my left side, I'll have a Python class. Let's create a simple Python class. So I'm going to do class keyword. I'm going to name this class person. It's not going to inherit from anything. And then I'm going to create my dunder init method. Remember, this is the first method that gets automatically called to initialize our class. It has to take in a self parameter. We can take in a name, maybe a date of birth. And then we're going to create some instance attributes. So we'll do name equals name, self.dob equals date of birth. And nothing too exciting. Let's maybe another function. Let's call it get name. This will take in self. Remember, every instance method for Python has taken that self keyword, even though we don't pass it in. And then we can return, self.name. All right, very simple class here. Obviously, we can create much more complicated classes, but for this example, this should suffice. Again, just a reminder, normally when we create multiple classes, we want to separate them into different files. So each class should get its own file. But for example, I'm just going to create multiple classes in the same file. Doesn't hurt. It's just not the best code organization. In this case, I'm going to create a student class that's going to inherit functionality from a person class. This will also have an init method. Init, let's say self, takes in a student's ID, name, and date of birth. Because a student is still a person, but the student additionally has a student ID, which a random person might not have a student ID associated with them. So we'll do super. Let's go with who do I want to chat with? Jordan Smith. Can you remind me what the super method does in Python?
It makes it so you don't need to write out all the selves again. Self equals.
Sort of, but not really. So super method is actually calling our base class. So super knows the proper base class. We could hard code person here, but if you go back to our OP lectures, it's a little less robust. So we should be using the super method to call our base class. We'll call our init method. We want to pass it a name and date of birth. All right, and then additionally, we want to create an instance method for student ID. Student ID, and that's going to be set to the new value here. So again, student has additional data that we want to keep track of. Otherwise, our person class, which is our base class, will store the name and date of birth. Let's create one function here. So def gets ID, self, again, nothing too complicated here, self.student ID. All right, you guys with me? All right, if I want to create an instance of my student class, I can do that by simply creating a variable and creating a student instance by calling the student class, passing in the relevant details. Let's say ID will be 1, student name will be Albert Einstein. And then I did look up his date of birth. Albert Einstein was actually born on 1879, March 14th, which is kind of interesting. He's born on Pi Day, obviously coincidental, but that is his birthday. So this will be a student instance. If we want to print out something, we could do, print s dot get student ID or get ID, and then maybe s dot get name. All right, so I'm going to run my Python file just to see if this works, if I mistyped anything. So I'll do Python classes.py. All right, notice we get an output of 1 Albert Einstein, because 1 is the student ID that we set. Albert Einstein is the name we set for this particular student. What questions do you guys have about classes in Python? Hopefully there should be a review, but want to make sure we are not forgetting anything from our OOP week. Again, the super keyword, just a handy way to call our base class, so we don't have to call it with the person directly. We could, but it's not the best design, because again, if we change our base class, we need to change all those instances. Yeah. All right. So this is creating a class in an instance in Python. Let's kind of compare that with how we do it in JavaScript, just to make sure we understand the kind of the mirroring and the differences also. So for creating a class in JavaScript, we use the class keyword. Surprisingly, the same keyword. We name our class, and then we use curly braces, such as JavaScript. To create our equivalent init method, we use a special function that is named Constructor. You must name it Constructor, much like you must name your init method underscore init. We're going to use a method called Constructor. Constructor is what will take in your values. In this case, we want to pass in the name and date of birth. And we can set it to instance value. So this dot name and this dot date of birth. All right, so a couple things to point out here already. Again, one thing is the init method. Its equivalent is called Constructor. So keep that in mind. The other thing I want to highlight here is that we do not pass in a self keyword to instance methods in JavaScript. That is a Python specific thing. That is not something we do in JavaScript. Additionally, there's this magic keyword called this. So the this keyword in JavaScript is the same functionality as the self keyword in Python. It refers to the instance itself. However, instead of having it passed in, the this keyword is automatically accessible anywhere inside our class. Kevin, did you have a question?
No, my computer crashed and I just came back on.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right. So again, kind of highlight the differences. Init method here, constructor here, self keyword here that needs to be passed in. This keyword here that does not need to be passed in. It's automatically accessible just through the design of a class in JavaScript. If we want to create a method, we could create a method to get name. It's pretty much similar. So we return this dot name. All right. So again, this keyword replaces self. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. We access instance attributes the same way. Just do a dot, whatever the name is. In this case, it's name. But this is what the equivalent class would look like for JavaScript. If we want to create a student class, well, we follow a similar pattern. So class student. But instead of using the syntax like this for inheritance, we use extends and then the class name. So what this is saying is the student class is going to add on to the person class or extend its functionality is the way I think of it. So this way, student will inherit from person, and now we could do similar things as we did before. So constructor, this will take in student ID. We're in JavaScript, so we should snake case, name, and date of birth. A little difference in how we use super. Again, super exists in JavaScript also, but it's a little different syntax. In this case, we call super and just pass name and date of birth directly. And this dot student ID equals student ID. All right, last key difference, when you instantiate or create an instance of your class, let's say I want to do s, let s equal new student, and we pass in the name or ID, name, it's all the same here, so it's copy and paste. Key thing here, let me make this a little smaller. Key thing here, you need to use this new keyword in front of your class that you're instantiating. It's just syntax thing with JavaScript. That's easy to forget because in Python, we do not have a new keyword here, right? We just do s equals student, pass in the details. Here we need to do s equals new student, and then everything else should work the same. So I do, console.log. You can call methods the same way, s.get ID. I guess these should have been snake case. Oh, Python. Get name, get ID, name. Sorry, just making sure I have the proper casing for JavaScript and Python. So we have get ID and s.get. All right, so again, very similar syntax, just a few different items. Again, inheritance is a little different. We use extends keyword. Creating an instance, we use a new keyword. And our init method is now constructor, is what we refer to as a constructor in JavaScript. Let's give this a run, make sure I did not make any syntax errors. So we're going to do node, because this is JavaScript, classes.
I think you're missing a get ID function.
Yes, indeed. You guys are awesome. Yes, so I need a get ID function, which is what I left off here. And it will return, instead of self, remember we use the this keyword. It must be named this, versus in Python, technically, I could call this donuts and donuts would work. It's just a naming variable. But in JavaScript, you have to use this. That is a magic keyword that JavaScript kind of provides and knows how to use. Can I clean this up because donuts are not what we want here? Okay, so we return this .student ID, and then I need a closing brace. All right, so this should put out the same thing as before. So node.class.js.
You're passing self into get ID, and shouldn't you have consts or something in front of your get IDs there?
Good question. The question is, should we have function here? The answer is no. Class syntax is a little different than you would expect. So you do not want to use the function keyword. I guess other question was, can we use const to make this a fat arrow function? Even if you do a fat arrow function, you don't want to use const. It's kind of weird. The syntax is a little wonky, I agree. But yeah, you don't have anything before your function definition. You just kind of assign it without a let, without a const, without a function. It's weird, I know. But yeah, these are methods. So methods inside of class, don't use a function keyword. That's the way I remember it. All right, so given this should print out the same thing. We got undefined because I did not. What I do here? Student ID.
Snake case.
Yes, casing. All right, so if I do this node, there we go. So we got the ID and we got the name, just like we did in Python. All right, so that was a quick primer on classes in JavaScript. Again, we're not going to do too much OOP stuff in JavaScript, but it is possible. Class-based components in React are using OOP, so that's why we're going through this introduction. But kind of just get familiar with the differences and the similarities. Let me zoom out just because they all fit. But yeah, what questions do you guys have about class structures or OOP design in Python or in JavaScript, or Python if you have a question in Python?
Why don't you need the semicolons in JavaScript?
So what was the question? Semicolons? Yeah. So semicolons in JavaScript are optional, like 99.9% of the time. JavaScript will automatically insert semicolons for you. So at the end of each expression, semicolons are automatically entered in for you. So you don't have to. Some might argue it's more proper just to add them in, but it's optional for the most part. There are a few limited cases where a semicolon can get you. One case I kind of introduced earlier. If you have a new line after return statement, this is not going to be compiled because JavaScript automatically inserts a semicolon right there. Because again, that's just the way JavaScript interprets a return statement. Just like it adds automatically a semicolon there. Again, we're not adding it manually. So JavaScript will think this is return and not execute this piece of code. So that's why in this case, we need to insert parentheses for that to work correctly. So we talked about this in React. So if you add parentheses, that will actually return that value. Or just put it on one line if you don't want to deal with that hassle. But that's like one rare case where the automatic semicolon insertion can kind of bite you. But otherwise, you don't have to add semicolons. Okay, I'm just gonna keep this up for a few more seconds. You guys can stare at it, make sure you understand, okay, extends instead of using the parentheses for inheritance, this keyword instead of using self. Again, we don't pass in this keyword to any instance methods, unlike Python where we have to pass in self as a first parameter. And then we instantiate a new, when we instantiate a class instance, we got to use a new keyword for JavaScript. Just some things to keep in mind because there's syntactical differences. Okay, so with that under our belts, let's quickly get to class-based components. So I'm going to get rid of these files, don't want them anymore. Let's go back to our React projects. Let's take a look at one of our components here. So I'm going to go. Go for it.
Oh, sorry, quick question. Can you, would you be able to possibly upload this code later after the lecture?
Sure.
Thanks.
All right, so let's go to our clicky thing component. Hopefully you guys made it this far. If not, you can modify your app.js if your logic was here. But what I'm going to do is convert this to a class-based component and then talk about some of the changes that we had to make. Again, all of it's syntactical. Functionally, it's going to behave the same exact way. All right, so maybe if I want to maybe take some notes here, I'm going to say steps to convert functional component to class-based component. Class-based, you can just say class component, they're interchangeable. All right, what steps do I need to do? So first thing I want to do, let's say step 1, change function header to class syntax. Let's see, header syntax, I'm not sure if the proper terminology, to class header. What I mean by that is the first line where we declare our component. We don't want to use function anymore, we want to use class. So first thing I'm going to change is change this to class. And now we need to change this to be like that. So now we have clicky thing. The one thing we need to add in here also, so maybe add this as a step 1B or 1A. We must inherit from React.component. So React.component is a class, and our component must inherit from that for it to be a component. So to do that, we need to import it. So I'm going to do that with my import here, components. So this component class is coming from our React library. Now that I've imported it, I can extend that class components. All right. Please don't pay attention to this blue squiggly line. It's just the naming thing that I've done. So that was step 1 and 1A. We need to inherit from React components, maybe do a 1B to make sure we know that we need to import components from React. Any questions on step 1? All right, moving on to step 2. Again, there's not too many steps involved, but there are a few key changes. Step 2, let's kind of just go through it line by line. So we have state values. If you remember, before lunch where I mentioned if you're using class-based components, we do not use the useState hook. So here we need to change state values from using useState to a state object. All right, so I'm going to take the state value again. We don't want to use useState. The equivalent of this in a class is going to be simply a value called state, must be called state. So let's put that as 2B. 2A, I guess, must create a value called state that will be an object. Right, so must be called state. Exactly state, lowercase. Don't mess with that naming. Right, the state will contain all our state values all in one object. So in this case, we only have one state value called counter. So I'll do counter and then initialize it to 0. Right, so this is equivalence. This is functional based. I'm just going to keep this up momentarily. Functional components, state, and then this is class components. All right, so kind of see the similarities. We still have a value called counter. We initialize to 0, but in this case, we don't have a set counter updater where there's something else we need to use. Okay, that takes care of our one state value we have here. And delete that. All right, so we have a state value counter. Let's go to our event handler. So this is item number 3. Change methods to satisfy class naming syntax. What I mean by that is what we just went over. Again, we can't use these const or let keywords or even function keywords. We're just going to drop that off, and that's a proper syntax. Again, I'm not happy with it either. It's kind of inconsistent, but just know inside of classes, you don't want to use const or let to define class variables or class instance function, class function, sorry. All right, so I just chopped that off. So instead of the const, I have increment counter, fat arrow functions. That all is cool. I'm gonna make that a 4 because I want to slide in a 3 here related to states. So 3, updating states must use set state. This dot set state. All right, so this dot set state is a function. Update states, updating. All right, so we must use this function called set state. It is something that it's already provided to us. It's not something we have control over. We just have to use it. Similar to how in our functional components, I guess I lost all my code there, but we have to use that use state and use the updater that it provided. In this case, for classes, we have to use this set state. All right, so again, I can't use set counter. Set counter no longer exists in my world for my class-based component. Instead, I want to do something like this dot set state, and then I'm going to pass it a new dictionary. That dictionary is going to have only the value I want to update. I might need to highlight this a little better, but this example won't cover it. So let's say I want my new counter to be counter +1. I can do it that way. Again, this is the non-ideal way. I would probably want to get the previous value. If I wanted to do it like the more appropriate way, I need to take in prev state, I think. Let me know if you guys hate this and go back to whatever we want, but this will be prev state dot counter. So now we use the previous values in case we have a bunch of chains updates. This will use the correct value. I believe this is correct syntax. Let's take a quick look. So we'll do React set states, prev state. All right, Stack Overflow, a good friend of ours. Yep, prev state looks like it's first parameter. We got to return a dictionary. All right, so we take in previous value, return a dictionary containing the new value. The thing I want to point out here, not quite highlighted here. Let's say I had another value in here. Let's say I had something else as another state value that's initialized to donuts, whatever. When I do a set state like this will only update this particular value. What I mean by that is this is not going to overwrite and erase something else from my state value. You guys got that? So again, my set state is specifically updating counter, so that counter will take on a new value. Even though I'm not providing something else here, like that's not going to result in something else being wiped out from my state values. If I omit it from here, it just won't be updated. It won't be modified. It won't be touched at all. Something else will be left alone. What questions do you guys have about set state?
How would you do it if you had to update that second value on line 18? Would you need another function?
You can do it all in one or do it separately, depending on if you need to do them together. So if I wanted to update, something else right here, I could do that together too. I could say, cupcakes. So now this will be cupcakes the first time this increments and always be cupcakes after that. Or I can do it separately. If they're independent, then I likely want to update them independently. But yeah, again, you just pass a dictionary, an object with the key that you want to update. If you leave off the key, that item will be untouched. It won't be deleted. It won't be removed from your state values. All right, so that was item 3. Update state values must use set state. So again, this keyword is the hardest thing to remember. It's what up there with, me forgetting my colons in Python, and among other things I always forget. Just anytime you want to access something within your class, you need to use this keyword. So if I want to use the state value, I need to use this dot state. I can't just use state directly. So we'll see that down here, and that'll be our item number 5. Maybe I want to make that 4, but we'll do it 5. All state and prop values should change to this dot state and this dot props whatever dot whatever. Again, whatever is not literally what I mean. Whatever is just the name of the state value. So if we see that down in our code flow, I guess I need to add another item. Sorry, there are a number of steps, but it's not really that much to convert them. So let's do, I'll do a 6. That's kind of like the last thing I usually do. 6. You must add in a render function to return the JSX you want. Right? So for our functional components, we simply just return JSX. But for class-based components, we need to create a function specifically named render that will contain our JSX. So all we need to do is, this is my previous JSX, just wrap that in a render function. It must be named render, and that's all you do. It's just a simple tab, add that function, great, we're done with that step. So again, every class-based component must have a render function, because that's what's going to be called to actually render that component, and that should contain a return of your JSX. So essentially what we're doing before, just wrapped in a render function. So that's item 6. Item 5, we need to take care of that. All state and prop values should be changed to use this dot state and this dot props. So let's take a look at that. All right, I'm using a state value right here. So like, it's not counter. It's not state.counter. Again, this is a typical mistake people will make. They're like, okay, I have a state object here. I want to use that state value, so I'm just use state.counter, I'm done. Nope. Anytime you access something within the class, you need to access it via this dot state, because this is the particular instance that has it. Again, kind of tricky, kind of easy to forget. It's fine. Just understand that. Same thing goes with this increment counter. I need to access it within the class. I need to do a this dot increment counter. Right, with this keyword, you're going to see it a lot. Get used to it. All right, and that's pretty much it for converting to class-based component. I know it seems like a lot, but a lot of these steps are pretty quick. It's just, flipping state values. The hardest part for me is changing the updaters to set state, because sometimes it's a little tricky to get it to work right or look right. But the render function, simple, changing your state value to this dot state, pretty simple to get all those. Okay, so I converted this particular component to a class-based component. You totally can use functional-based components and class-based components interchangeably. So right now, my button and my label, they're still functional components. This is going to work totally fine, no problem. Again, it's just a syntax thing. At the end of the day, the same JavaScript gets created, behind the scenes. But typically speaking, you don't want to mix and match functional-based components and class-based components, because that's just wrong in terms of consistency. So if you pick class-based components, everything should be a class-based component. If you pick functional-based components, everything in your app should be functional-based components. Don't pick and choose and mix and match. That's just going to create chaos and unhappy code reviewers. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. But just understand the same steps we applied here, these 6 steps or whatever, same thing would go here. Fine, I'll do my label since it's simple, super simple. So remember, we need to import components from React. And then we want to change our function header to class my label that extends components. And then there's one question that pops up in my head, so we'll cover that with this example. I'm glad we do this. All right, render. We need a render function. That's simple. Render. Wrap that. Not that. All right, so we got a render function. We don't have any state values we got to worry about, so that's fine. We create our class. The last thing we need to do is props. So props need to change to this dot props. Otherwise, it's the same. Question that you might have is, how do props automatically just show up here? And that's just some of the magic. Props automatically get passed to your class, and your class is storing the props internally. We are not seeing props kind of anywhere here, but it does exist. A little more into the weeds, if you guys care. As we talked about, each class can have a constructor. This constructor gets props passed to it. What it does with those props is calls the base class and pass the props down to it, because this component class is the one actually keeping track of your props. Now, I do not need to add this constructor if this is all I want, because if you omit a constructor, there's something called a default constructor that gets created, and it does the default functionality. In this case, the props will be passed down to a component automatically. So we don't need to do that. But if we need to do something additional in our initialization, like, we wanted to, do an alert here when this gets created, hello, then we might want a constructor and do some initialization. Again, this is not proper initialization, sorry. But you might need to use a constructor. Usually you will not be using constructors for React. Okay, I'm just gonna quickly run this, make sure I did not break new functionality. So we'll do cd into Monday app. We'll do npm start. Hopefully I didn't break anything, but quite possible. Starting, looking promising. Nope, failed to compile. Index.js does not match. Whoa. What I expected. All right, failed.
I know that you had a capital R when you did the import React in your mylabel.js. I don't know if that would have anything to do with this, but.
Good thought. I don't think that's an issue, like right here. Yeah, I don't think that matters. I don't know why it's talking about index.js. Did I change anything in here? Huh.
I know mine's working. I followed along.
All right, well, of course I had the bad luck. Something went askew here. Clicky thing. All right, well, it's good to know that you guys got to work while I seem to have ran into an issue. I don't know why it's complaining about index.
Mine's not working and I followed along, so.
Did you get the same error that I did?
Yep.
All right, let's try to figure this out in the next few minutes. Else we'll kind of abandon ship, but ideally this should work. Let's try to see index.js. Let's do a quick Google. Google's our friend, so we can copy that error message, go to the Googles, see what they say. Stack Overflow looks like similar to what I had. Let's see what they say. Should be, oh, you are right. I apologize. I forgot who said that. We need a capital R, it looks like, for, wait, no, lowercase. Sorry, that's good. I had your lowercase. Did I have uppercase anymore?
Yeah, it was in.
It's under my label, is it?
Thank you. You guys don't miss a beat. Thank you. That was my issue. Thank you. I apologize. Yes, lowercase r for React. Thank you. That was true to point out before. Kind of lost my components there. Thank you. Yes, lowercase r in React. That should have you up and running. So make sure your Reacts are proper with that. Let's refresh. All right, there we go. We got all of our buttons back. Again, some of these are functional components, some are class-based, no functionality change. But in an ideal world, all of them should be one or the other. Again, we're gonna usually emphasize functional-based components, but we're introducing class-based components because it is important to know. All right, that was a lot of React talk. Let's actually get you to your challenges, because that's obviously the best way to learn React. So I'm gonna stop the recording here.